For this session, I want to talk about the heart of the course. The heart of this course is training in calm abiding meditation, and then taking each little bit of progress you've made in calm abiding meditation and extending it out to other activities in your life using bridging activities. Thereby, when your calm abiding improves on the cushion, right? When you gain some competency in each level of the 9 stages, which will be one of our topics today, then you can level up what it is you're doing in your bridging activities. When you level up the bridging activities, this starts to expand and sort of naturalize whichever level of capability you've attained. And then the bar is higher when you sit down on the cushion. And so you can take the next step. You take the next step, and then you bring this back over to your life. And so it goes. So we're trying to attain this laser-like mind that is extraordinarily awake and has no bias in its perception of reality, and is characterized by mental and physical suppleness. That definition is something that you can look at in the course notes earlier in the course. In order to attain such a state, we need to go through a process of 9 stages. And remember, even according to the great metastagers, these 9 stages are more rough sort of outlines. They're meant to be helpful signposts along the way, so you can understand that the process is logical, you can understand what to do on each step, and you can make more or less consistent progress along the way. My presentation is mostly pulled out of the Lamrim Chenmo, but this has been supplemented in a number of other places, with a number of texts rather from a number of other places. It's somewhat similar, the 9-stage model, to the Taoist Wild Horse Taming diagram and the Zen Wild Ox Taming diagram, but those 2 diagrams are a bit more general than this presentation. Those, in my understanding, seem to present a fresh practitioner who hasn't done much progressing along the whole path to full awakening within a given tradition, whereas the 9 stages is just relating to attaining the first form realm concentration, access level concentration, as it's sometimes called, shamatha, as it's sometimes called, so that you can use such a mind to then permanently transform the way that the mind functions, and you can become familiar with the actual nature of your own consciousness and the actual nature of objects in your reality, which produces liberation, and then produces enlightenment, according to the Buddhist tradition at large. In the course notes, you'll also see this. The wild elephant taming diagram is something that's associated with this model, and it's a bit more precise than my understanding of these 2 diagrams. These 2 diagrams are more so a general picture of what's going on, and this is a pictorial representation of very, very specific things. Certain mental factors, certain accomplishments on that stage-wise process, and so forth. For most of you who have been in this course a little while, you've already heard me talk a lot about you need to sit down and apply a great deal of force and effort in order to generate concentration. This will not be relaxing. This will not be a nice little coffee break from your life. This will be like going to the gym and doing powerlifting for 5 minutes. This will be extremely intense effort. And that may sound strange because of all the pictures of people sitting so nicely and all this and all the talk about peace and what have you in religious traditions in general, but Buddhism specifically. But when you look at the advice given by great meditators like Venerable Kamalashila in his Bhavanakrama, and all of the traditions that have borrowed from his model of how to accomplish this process, they talk about mainly using strenuous conveying, forceful conveying. In other words, bringing your attention to the object with intense force. The reason for this is the force of your distraction is incredible. And you need an incredible force of willpower fighting it in the other direction. If you don't do that, you won't overcome the initial phases of a distracted mind. So when you're working on this type of training and concentration, you need a forceful type of attention, not a just relax and observe kind of attention. That's a different type of technique. This technique, the mind needs to be very, very, very intentionally engaged with what it's doing, as though you're staring at a swordsman, and if your concentration flags, he's going to cut you. Right? This is how they talk about it in the texts sometimes. Okay. So, just in general, you can see over here, there are 9 stages to the accomplishment of calm abiding, shine, shamatha, the first form realm, concentration, call it whatever you'd like. In order to complete just the first sort of level of samadhi training, of single-pointed concentration training, it's going to more or less fall into 9 distinct stages of development. The first stage is you're sitting down, right, and you're applying this in tremendous effort. You're fighting with your mind. It's running all over the place. But at some point, you gain enough sort of force of intention, and you gain enough awareness of what's going on in your own mind to realize a few things. First, you realize your mind is absolutely insane, and it'll seem like it's way crazier than it's ever been in your life. That's not an indication that you're going nuts. It's an indication that you're realizing what your mind is like for the first time. So that's a very, very good sign. And Genlam Rinpa spent 45 years in very nearly solitary retreat doing his own meditation training. So he is a highly accomplished meditator who's providing this advice, and you find this advice all over the place. It goes without saying the main problem you're going to be encountering is fighting your attachment. So the mind is going to be running, looking for something more entertaining to do, or trying to run away from some sensation in the body and basically chasing comfort, right? So instead of just sitting there and dealing with the discomfort and trying to stay on the object, it starts fantasizing about, oh, well, if I move my left leg like this, then it'll stop tingling, so I'm going to do this for a little while, whatever, right? The mind is chasing after comfort, or chasing after stimulation in the senses, or chasing after stimulation in terms of generating concepts. And that's what we're fighting. That's the main thing that we're fighting against on this first stage. We're also fighting against that tendency all the way up to the 4th stage. But the first stage, we have to apply just incredible effort of forcefully bringing the mind back to what we're doing. Otherwise, we won't accomplish this stage. You may notice a lot of people talk about falling asleep on this stage, but that's sort of a minor problem. It tends to clear itself up. So if that's happening, it's just a sign that you're doing a decent job kind of generating the effort that you need to accomplish this stage, and it's tiring, you know. Especially if you're doing a lot of sessions in one day, you'll find that you get quite sleepy. It's like going to the gym, you know. It's very, very intense. Now, you've accomplished this stage when you can keep the mind focused on the breath for about 21 breaths with relative ease. One of my other teachers also mentioned Geshe Dakpa Tokyo mentioned that when you can bring the mind back to the object with relative ease, that's also a sign you've attained this first stage. So somewhere between the level of being able to bring the mind back fairly easily to the activity you intended to do and being able to hold it on the breath for 21 breaths is the accomplishment of the first stage. Fixation with some continuity. So in these first 4 stages, remember, we're just trying to develop concentration. We're trying to develop stability of mind. We're trying to get the mind to stop chasing after objects. So in the first 4 levels, we are slowly reducing the amount of excitement that we're chasing so that the mind is more stable on the object, more stable on the object, more stable on the object. So this stage is accomplished when the mind can rest on the object uninterrupted for about 3 minutes, which is about the length of time that it will take you to do 108 rounds of Om Mani Padme Hum. So you can think about this as somewhere between maybe 3 to 5 minutes, being able to hold your mind on an object without it jumping off, right? So 21 breaths, if you're breathing at a normal pace, will probably be a little bit less than that. So at this stage, your mind still frequently loses the object. So you're losing the object, but now you're spending a lot less time running around in La La Land before you come back. You're spending a lot less time at Walmart before you come back. You start to notice much more quickly, oh, I've lost the object, and you come back, right? So it used to be on the first stage, you spent most of your time chasing around other objects. You were smelling, tasting, hearing, touching, various things with the 5 senses and running around with those instead of being with the selected object. And now it has become inverted. So you spend most of the session on the object, you lose it sometimes, and you run around for a little while and you notice it pretty quickly and you bring it right back, and then you hang out on the object for a long time, right? So this has become inverted. That's the sign that you've attained the second stage. Now, during the next 5 stages, the mind is going to spend more time on the object than being distracted by attractive things. And so from level 3 onwards, the quality of your concentration changes, right? The quality of your concentration changes. So you're no longer applying such a intense, really powerful effort to try to keep the mind on the object. Because now the mind is a little bit more cooperative. And so now they change the name and they call the type of attention you're bringing to the object interrupted conveying. So the effort to hold it on the object is now a little bit less. So now you're able to refine the process of holding just a little bit more because the effort required to just hold it is less. So now what you can see in holding it is more, which means that you can work on subtler issues in the process. Patch-like fixation. So at this stage, your recollection and vigilance have developed to such a level that your sessions are almost never interrupted by gross excitement. So gross excitement, if you go back to the earlier part of the notes, is when the mind jumps off to a different object, right? You were holding the breath, and then the mind is seeing something in front of you. You were holding the breath, and then the mind jumps to some thought about what you have to do later today, and so on. So you've attained the third stage when the mind can stay on the breath, and as soon as it leaves, and it goes bang, and it hits something else, you go, oh, I'm off the object, boom, and it comes right back. So patch-like fixation is called patch-like because you patch up the concentration immediately. They say it's almost like a piece of cloth and there's a little hole and you just patch up the hole quickly. Yeah. So just like that, when the meditation is only interrupted by little gaps in the training and concentration. So you're sitting there for maybe 30 minutes, and instead of having 2/3 on the object, 1/3 off the object. There are just like a few moments off the object every now and then. So you're on the object 95 whatever percent of the time. And then level 4, close fixation. So this occurs when you sit down for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, say, and the mind never jumps off the object, ever. The mind always stays on the object for the session. It does not jump off whatsoever. So at this stage, if you relax your effort to hold the mind on the object, then it will lose it. So this is not effortless concentration. This is very important because people get a bit of like, oh, the mind's a little calm now, and so they relax the effort and they become a noodle, and then the mind jumps. So we're not going to be relaxing effort in this training process until the very end. We have a long way to go, my friends. So strong effort, strong effort is still required, but you can hold the mind on the object, and for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, give or take, right, depending on how you're doing that day and whatever, the mind will stay on the object without jumping. Now, this is very interesting. So at this stage, your recollection has matured. So what does this mean? If you go back to the earlier part of the notes, recollection, also called mindfulness, the Pali word is sati, the Sanskrit word is smrti, the Tibetan word is, I forget. In any case, this word can be translated in so many ways. I think non-forgetfulness is useful. I think recollection is useful. It's not just sort of going into an observer state and being an observer like a mere awareness, right? That's not what mindfulness is or recollection is. It is remembering, well, let me quote Geshe Dakpa Chokyo. It is the active act of not forgetting what you intended to do. So you intended to hold the mind on the breath. And there's a mental factor, there's a component of your mind which actively does not forget to continue holding the mind on the breath, right? At this stage, where you have close fixation, right, your ability to not forget what you're doing has matured because you're never going to forget what you're doing while you're in the midst of doing it. So how could you improve it any more than that? It's already as good as it's going to get, yeah? So at this stage, one can still get tired from the effort. So for example, if you're holding on the object and there's no tendency to forget, but a bit of time goes by and then you get tired, you get sleepy, whatever. Okay, then the effort's going to reduce and the mind will jump. Or you're doing a session early in the morning, or you're doing it late at night, or you just had a big meal, or the reality of life has hit you. You're feeling grief, you're feeling lust, you're feeling loss, whatever. And because the delusions are much stronger that particular day, you have the tendency to fall off the object. In any case, still, this is close fixation because you're sitting down for 30 minutes on most days and bang, you set the intention and the mind is just there and it just stays there. With the effort to hold it there, it won't move. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Some of you have asked me, well, I'm getting a little tired on the cushion, my mind's starting to fall asleep, blah, blah, blah. My mind's pretty stable now, so, should I start working on getting rid of laxity, making my mind brighter and more alert and more fresh and all this? And in general, the answer is no. You can refresh the mind a little bit, especially if the mind's really sleepy. But before you get to this stage, your primary issue is that the mind jumps. And if you start making the mind even brighter and more energetic, it's just going to jump even more. So before you start making the mind really energetic and really alive and really awake, you need to settle the mind and make it stay where you wanted it to stay and get that ability completely mature, where for 30 or 45 minutes, most of the time when you sit down, bang, it just stays where you put it, right? Then you start refreshing the mind, brightening the mind, making the mind highly lucid, making its cognitive engagement with the object even brighter, brighter, brighter. Okay, now this is what you start working on the fifth stage. So here, having already attained on this stage the ability to stay on the object, you start brightening the mind, right? Now that it's stable, you start brightening the mind, making the mind even sharper, even fresher, even more cognitively capable, right? It's very, very awake. And at some point, the tendency for your mind to get tired stops, right? The tendency for your mind to get so almost like you're looking at the object through a bunch of layers of cellophane or cling film, as they call it here in the UK, that tendency stops. So your mind doesn't have a tendency to sink and get sort of gray, where it's sort of half doing what it's very stable, but it's only kind of half alive while it's doing what it's doing, instead of being fully alive, more alive than you are normally. So on this, to attain this stage, gross laxity needs to be overcome. Gross laxity is when your mind becomes so dull from staying in a concentrated state without refreshing the mind that basically it starts to gray. The cognitive capability of the mind starts to gray. And if you just sit in this sort of peaceful, dumb state of mind, you'll get stupider, right? You're cultivating a mind that can rest somewhere non-conceptually while being very dull. If you become habituated to that, if that becomes your habit, being in a non-conceptual dull state, then your ordinary intelligence, your ability to form sentences, to form thoughts, to pick things apart conceptually, will decline. And you'll become dumber. So don't do that. One of my teachers said that even if you only are doing about like an hour of practice a day, if you're sitting in dullness like this, you'll get stupider pretty quickly. Like within a year or so, you'll be less intelligent than you were. So you need to be aware of this. So once that tendency for the mind to become dull, because it's now stable, goes away by brightening the mind, freshening the mind in the session. Okay, now you've attained the fifth stage. On this stage, you also start to really, really notice the problem of mental scattering, which I called distraction earlier. So before, the big problem was the mind was jumping because of excitement, because of a derivative of attachment. The mind was exaggerating positive qualities of things and chasing after those things because of the exaggerated positive qualities. Scattering or distraction is basically everything else, where the mind jumps for some other reason. It jumps because you're angry at someone. It jumps because you're thinking about some virtues you did and how amazing those virtues were, and so on. One of those things is it will notice that there are disadvantages to being, in particular, being attracted to male and female bodies, and being distracted by the fact that you have a male or female body. It'll notice this big disadvantage. In any case, at this stage, you also, while overcoming laxity, you also significantly overcome scattering, right? Now, pacification. So on the previous stage, you were brightening the mind, you were reducing scattering, right? And the mind became so bright that now you can notice much subtler problems. Much subtler problems. On this next stage, the big issue is subtle forgetfulness, subtle non-recollection, the subtle tendency to lose the object. So what is this? The subtle tendency to lose the object is you're sitting and holding the object, and in your mind you can sort of feel the movement of a thought about to form, and the thought doesn't form. It doesn't form, your mind doesn't jump to the thought, but the movement of a thought about to form is there. Geshe Dakpa called it ideation. In the background, there are ideas about to form. I sometimes call it itchiness. There's sort of like an itch in the back of your mind that wants to be scratched. In Zen, sometimes they talk about water under the ice. The river is completely frozen on the surface. When you look at it, you can't see any movement. But you can hear there's this gurgling going on under the surface. So, when the mind becomes stable enough and lucid and bright enough, then you start to notice this, and you might notice this before, but at this stage you can really start dealing with it. Then you start to notice, oh, there's this subtle movement going on in the background it's not jumping, but it wants to jump. There's a tendency to jump, even though it's not jumping. There's a tendency to form a new thought, even though it's not thinking. There's a tendency to jump to something else, even though it's not jumping. And so you have to increase the strength of the hold that you have on the object, and through increasing the strength of the hold, that subtle movement stops. On this stage, the disadvantages of mental scattering, subtle forgetfulness, and inward distraction of laxity appear vividly through powerfully increased vigilance, says Jinlam Rinpa. What does this mean? Vigilance is the quality of the mind being able to detect what's going on in the mind, right? So it's recently been translated as meta-awareness. It is awareness of your awareness. You're becoming increasingly aware of what's actually going on in your mind. On this stage, vigilance becomes fully developed, where you can see all the layers of what's happening in your mind, at least as relevant to this type of training. And that powerfully increased vigilance on this stage then makes it very, very clear that there's a little bit of laxity occurring, there's a little bit of scattering occurring, there's a little bit of subtle excitement occurring, and all of these need to go, right? So the big thing that you're starting to cut off, as I said, is the subtle excitement at this stage. You're starting to cut that subtle excitement. And also, from here to the end of the process, you're sort of removing subtler layers, right? This is where the model is kind of gray, in particular at this level, where use this as a guidepost when you get to this stage. Also, you're reducing some of the subtle laxity, which is the mind's sort of not being absolutely stunningly crystal clear in its cognition of the object of the meditative state. And so some of that subtle laxity is being removed through the increased vigilance, the increased awareness of your own mind and what's going on. So on stage 7, now you have fully developed recollection, you have fully developed vigilance, right? And both of these are now confronting the very subtlest versions of the mind having a tendency to jump and the mind having a tendency to get slightly dull. And as I just said, Jinlam Rinpa says, in the text they can be quite thingy about, well, at this stage this happens, this stage that happens. But, when he actually did this training, 45 years in a cave, at least part of the time, he says, these really come on a sliding scale when you get to this level of subtlety. Traditionally, a lot of times they would talk about, well, on this stage, on the 7th stage, you'd be working on really just perfecting the last bit of your vigilance, the last bit of your awareness of your own mind, and just doing that will make the mind very, very bright. And making the mind very bright gets rid of subtle laxity. When the mind gets rid of subtle laxity, boom, now you have the 8th stage. You have flawless concentration with effort. In practice, Jenlon Rinpa says that basically both of the two subtle problems that you have, subtle excitement and subtle laxity, sort of go away on a sliding scale towards the end of the process of gaining the very, very, very subtle, very, very bright, very, very stable state of concentration. And so vigilance is therefore on guard, he says, for these very, very, very subtle changes in the quality of mind. Now, you've accomplished this stage when you sit down for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and none of those problems happen. So you're sitting there for hours, and the mind can rest on the object without even getting slightly dull in its cognitive brightness in terms of how it views the object, and without even having the subtlest bit of the mind having a tendency to jump or form an idea. So when that happens, you've accomplished single-pointed with effort. Single-pointed with effort is as it says on the tin, right? You now have this faultless state of single-pointed concentration, but to stay in it, you need effort. The problem on this stage is that you've, for years, have spent, or if you're doing it sort of all at once, for the last several months, you have spent a huge amount of energy making the mind having a habit of very responsive reaction, right? A little tiny bit of movement happens and bang, the antidote comes. A little tiny lethargy comes, bang, the antidote comes. So it's a highly refined machine. So on this stage now, the problem is that those problems aren't there, but the mind is vigilantly looking for these problems, and it sort of has false identifications where it goes, oh, I think the laxity is coming, and it refreshes the mind, even though it doesn't need to do that. Or it goes, oh, I think the movement is coming, right? I think that's movement, bang. And so this is called over-application. In other words, you start applying antidotes when there aren't problems there to fix. Sounds like some of my past relationships. Pabonka Rinpoche says, at this stage, just having the vigilance, just the fact that part of your mind is observing the quality of your mind as you're holding the object with flawless concentration is enough. Just that effort to do that is enough to stop subtle laxity, subtle scattering, subtle excitement from occurring. So at this stage, the effort is just to maintain a little bit of the effort to watch the quality of mind while the mind is single-pointedly focused. And just that effort to watch is enough to suppress the last bit of these distractions and dullness and so forth. Finally, you spend several weeks, several months, several years, whatever it takes. In the text it says somewhere between 4 months and 6 months if you were doing it full time, right? If you did this as a full-time job, that you could do this in 4 to 6 months. As long as you were ready and prepared and you had all the conditions in place, you could accomplish this in 4 to 6 months. For us, we're trying to do it in the middle of lay life, so do expect that this will take a little bit longer than 4 to 6 months, right? So through the power of continued practice, this is how you accomplish the effortless single-pointed concentration. Just like with everything else, if you practice, it becomes spontaneous, effortless, just how you do it. It doesn't require extra effort to do it that way. That's just how it is when you do it. So when you gain that level of capability, it's called effortless single-pointedness, right? when you turn your attention to something, it just arrives there with absolutely flawless concentration that requires no effort to generate. It's just like raising your arm or breathing in, breathing out. It is virtually effortless. And then the 10th stage of the 9 stages, or the accomplishment of the 9 stages, you could say, is calm abiding. So calm abiding is attained when you gain mental and physical pliancy. Mental and physical pliancy are a type of bliss, right? Where first you have this incredibly pleasurable sort of mental sensation of flexibility, and then that physically changes the body, where the body transforms and the body has this unbelievable light feeling and energetic feeling and is capable of doing very incredible sort of things physically. And at first, that will be almost intoxicating. And at that level where it's still sort of coarse, they would say, it's still sort of coarse and new, right? You're not used to it. They call it moving pliancy. And then you familiarize with that moving pliancy and you do more and more and more. And then you just sort of get used to the mind and body being unbelievably pliant and blissful like this. And then it sort of settles down a bit. And it may seem like it's gone away a little bit, but it hasn't gone away. You've just gotten used to the body and mind being that way. Once you've done that, then sometimes this is called special pliancy, right? Having attained that special pliancy, now you've attained calm abiding. And with that pliancy, that flexibility, that serviceability, you can now sit for days, weeks, months, if you need to, in order to complete some aspect of your training. The mind is just unbelievably capable at that point. It doesn't get tired. So, I mean, your capability at that stage to do transformation of your own mind is just astonishing. So, at this stage, you're no longer training in attention, you're now attentive. I think this is kind of funny, but Lama Tsongkhapa says, at this stage, you can now call a student attentive. And it's just very dry. If this was the standard we used for attentiveness in the West, then all of us would be diagnosed immediately with debilitating ADHD. So from here, one can continue on developing the second, third, and fourth form realm concentrations, which are just subtler refinements of using an object like the breath or whatever, a visualized image or what have you, as an object of concentration. But more powerfully at that, I mean, all along the way, but certainly at this stage, you can then use this mind to develop all of the skillful qualities on the path in a really fast, really profound, really intense way, because the mind is an incredible instrument now. It's just an unbelievable instrument. And most importantly, which will be the subject for tomorrow's talk, I think, you can use it to do rumination meditation at the highest level. You can use it to do meditation that has an analytical component at the highest possible level. So you can use this very subtle mind to analyze the actual nature of your mind, your body, and reality with crystal clear capability. Absolutely crystal clear. This is why Vipassana means seeing clearly. You've gotten rid of all the junk, and the mind just sees what's there. It doesn't see something else. And so in this state, you can really, really analyze in a profound way and see how things are. When you perfect that capability and combine it with this calm abiding capability, then you can do what's basically, you can have clear seeing, you can have special insight. These are both translations for Vipassana. And in particular, you can gain insight into selflessness, into emptiness, but you can also use this mind to do things like giving and taking that we were doing yesterday. You can use it for purification, like we did before. You can accumulate all of the Lam Rim realizations, the steps and stages on the greatest stages of the path. You can use it for all of the tantric meditations. So it becomes much easier to sit and do several 4-hour sessions a day where you're, visualizing the mandala of a deity and so forth. If you have this capability, now doesn't it? Because you're not going to get tired, it's not going to hurt. It's you know, it's just something that you're doing that's quite nice. Just another focused, interesting kind of experience. So tomorrow we'll carry on talking about how you then combine this laser-like, incredible, flexible, very bright, very stable mind with analysis in order to liberate the mind. And we're going to use Lama Tsongkhapa's model, which is basically from here to the attainment of calm abiding, you're going to build up better and better and better versions of analytic capability, which you can then later combine with the concentration. And as the analysis increases, the concentration will increase. As the concentration increases, the analysis will increase. So these two will grow up together. And therefore, by the time you get to the point where you have calm abiding, your analytical capability will also be quite strong, and the marriage will be much easier. The marriage of these two will be much, much easier, so realization will be easier to gain. This is, I think, one of the most profound kind of teachings from Lama Tsongkhapa's approach. Okay, let's do our 5-minute session. May the precious body mind I get born arise and grow. May that arisen not decline but increase more and more. May the precious supreme view of emptiness not yet born arise and grow. May that arisen not decline but increase more and more. See you tomorrow.